with this outline, I'm going to be covering tonight in North America, this morning in Asia, background on Jeju. So first, I'm going to be talking about its distinctive developments outside of the Korean Peninsula. And then to give some context for the massacre, I'll talk about what was going on with Jeju under Japanese colonialism. And then as a part of what a lot of Jeju historians call under a US empire. And then we'll move on to talking about the massacre up close, looking at specifically my field work that I did with Sogang University on Bukcheon Village, which is in the northern part next to Jeju City on the island, to give you a more kind of in-depth look at the characteristics of the massacre. And then we'll talk about how that history um, was silenced and the kind of conditions under which that history was silenced, and how that recovery then happened afterwards. So we'll look at three different aspects: the Korean Japanese Zainichi community and their role in recovering that history, the uh, survivors of villages and what they did there, the clandestine rituals that took place, and the democracy movements that then took place in 1980s that really drastically changed the scene. Um, if you wouldn't mind muting your microphones for now, then that might help listeners a bit. Thank you. Then we'll move on to talking about why do atrocities remain hidden from global history, considering three things. One, how the Korean War was never a concluded war. Second, the dysfunction of the United Nations. And then third, the rise of the ultra-right. And finally, we'll look at the recommendations that we have for ongoing peace activism in the area. So to begin, I want to start by giving you a background on Jeju Island before we move into some of the major causes for the massacre. So the island was developed some 2 million years ago when Jeju Island was formed by an underwater volcanic eruption that created an oval cone-shaped hollow mountain, the highest point in Korea, actually, that peaks in the middle of the island and gradually slopes down on all sides into the East Sea. The island's earliest human inhabitants can be traced back to the Neolithic period about 10,000 years ago. These inhabitants became the island's progenitors, and they founded the first kingdom of
No,
Tamna.
I'm on meeting right now.
Eddie, I think we can hear you. If you wouldn't mind muting your speaker, that'd be great. So they founded the first kingdom of Tamna around 57 before Common Era. Jeju Islanders developed a distinctive language and an ethnic identity that was different from the mainland peninsula. They were actively trading with kingdoms as far away as the Indian subcontinent and the Japanese archipelago. So they're very active in maritime trade around the South Pacific. As surrounding kingdoms then grew in strength, they vied for control over Jeju, even though the island witnessed major battles as foreign troops moved to conquer the Korean mainland. For most of their history, Jeju Islanders had minimal contact with mainlanders. Korean administrations considered them as outsiders for quite a long time, referring to them as quote unquote island barbarians, until around the Goryeo dynasty unified the Korean peninsula in 938 CE. So under the Goryeo, they officially placed the island under their own jurisdiction and renamed the island to Jeju, its current name. And the name Jeju refers to, it basically means village across the sea. So that marked their new acquisition, while it also distinguished its distance from the mainland. By 1256 Common Era, the island became a permanent prefecture of the peninsula. Jeju Island was incorporated for namesake into Korea, but islanders resented becoming a neglected frontier and for being used as a buffer against their southern enemies. The central government in Seoul, they used the island as a penal territory, banishing political dissidents to serve their administrative years on Jeju Island. So those governors that were sent there oftentimes believed that going to Jeju was like a death sentence. Jeju men were pressure to leave their mainland due to heavy head taxes that the Joseon dynasty, the last dynasty of Korea, imposed on them. While they did this and Jeju men fled for economic reasons, the Joseon dynasty also imposed anti-miscegenation laws that forbade Jeju women from following their men. So in
Mm.
turn, Valerie, would you mind turning off your microphone? Thank you for joining. Um, so in turn, the island became a kind of women-led island where female-led cottage industries started to flourish, and they also helped to establish this kind of matrifocal economic system that was quite different than what was happening under a very patriarchal Joseon dynasty. The gender imbalance was exacerbated under Japanese occupation, where more waves of young men migrated to the mainland and throughout the Japanese Empire for work and education. By the end of the Second World War, Jeju Island saw the largest concentration of men living abroad and a higher percentage of them living with foreign education than from any other part of Korea. As the male population was depleted, then the area of Jeju became known as the Island of Women. Jeju Islanders were made especially vulnerable because of their long-standing mainland marginalization in the 20th century. Passenger ships that carried people between Korea and Japan utilized Jeju Island for passage, allowing islanders easier access to Japan and a certain amount of freedom from colonial and mainland oppression. At the height of the Japanese colonial era, nearly a quarter of Jeju residents moved to Japan, relocating their families and relying heavily on wages they received while living abroad. And this was very different than what was happening from the mainland. In mainland Korea, many people believed that they could not take a ship, any form of transport to Japan, unless they were given special permission. And that was very different for Jeju Islanders. Living on the colonial metropole, meaning in Japan, afforded Jeju Islanders higher levels of education per capita than any other Korean. And many of them participated also in kind of left leftist political action that was less heavily regulated in Japan than it was in Korea and other parts of the Japanese colonies. And so they were able to participate in socialist organization, labor campaigns, etc., while they lived in Japan. Some invested their foreign capital into schools and other public service projects specifically for Jeju Island, making islanders' allegiance to the South Korean nation questionable in many of the eyes of the mainlanders. The island was exploited as an important military outpost during times of war, as you can see in this photo, which the Japanese understood really well. In 1937, the colonial government built an airport in the southwestern part of Jeju Island and established an Air Force base to aid in their strategies to instigate the Second Sino-Japanese War on mainland China. Um, Actually, some people think of that as the Third Sino-Japanese War, depending on if you think about the Indian War as the first. But anyway, the island saw limited military activity until the U.S. took over the Philippines in September of 1944. In the following months, as Japan braced itself against Allied overtake, they bolstered territories in and around Jeju Island to maintain a stronghold on the Korean Strait. While the U.S. was engaging in their bloodiest battle in Okinawa, which many of you may know if you're World War II buffs, killing over half of the island residents, that's some 100,000 casualties, in its effort to cut off Japan's southwestern supply chain, the Japanese dispatched some of their strongest military divisions from the Korean mainland and also provided additional assistance with their conquest of Manchuria. They then put them into Jeju's west coast. By the end of the gruesome battle in Okinawa on April of 1945, a Fukuoka front line, that's the closest city to Jeju, was established, and Jeju Island became a fully militarized final front against U.S. invasion. So, little known in world, we may not all know about Second World War. We may all know about the World War, the Korean War, but what is really lesser known is that the Cold War didn't start after the Korean War. It actually started in Korea before the Second World War was even over. This is the argument that a lot of historians, specialists on Jeju, want to emphasize. The U.S. entered a power vacuum left behind by the end of the Japanese Empire. There's really no question about that. In response to the Japanese invasion of Vietnam in July of 1941, U.S. Congress passed a motion to forbid any foreign rubber, scrap iron, and oil to be given to Japan. So what does that mean? All of their resources that they need to expand their military expansion was cut off. And then they also froze all of Japan's assets. So by the fall of 1941, Japan then initiates talks with the United States to kind of persuade them to reissue exports to Japan. In response, the United States demanded that Japan leave Southeast Asia and also leave China, to which Japan flatly refused. Japan set up a bold mission after that for total war, which all of us know about, against the US. They conducted a surprise attack on the US Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor in Oahu, Hawaii on December 7th, 1941. In that attack, they destroyed 7 battleships, 120 aircraft, and killed some 2,400 personnel. Then they quickly moved to expand throughout the South Pacific. So once the Pearl Harbor hurdle was eliminated, they were able to do this very quick expansion around the South Pacific. So by mid-1942, Japan had gained British Malaya, U.S. Philippines, British Singapore, Burma, New Guinea, East Indies. They gained ally with Thailand, which some people say was a kind of informal colonization as well. If you look at this map, their empire by this point, this is the greatest expanse of it, was so large it expanded as far as the Sakhalin Islands, as far west as Burma, and all the way into the the Southern Pacific. So, as collateral damage, many Japanese Americans argue that starting in 1942, Canada and U.S. issued Japanese internments as uh, American Japanese American citizens were being used as collateral because they needed time. The U.S. needed time to actually ramp up for the Pacific fight. And so those internments were created along the Pacific coast, all along the mainland western seaboard, and in Alaska, also in Hawaii. Nearly 100,000 Japanese Americans were forcibly relocated over a period of over 3 years. And then we see towards the end of World War II, the United States asked the Soviet Union to join them in a war to bring a swift end to the Pacific theater, but the Soviets refused. By midsummer of 1945, the U.S. State Department, equipped with its atomic bombs and its international energy sanctions, knew that Japan had no way of keeping the war going. They had cut off all their supplies. They were hearing reports that people were being starved out. There were no more rations. There were no more bullets in the Japanese Imperial Army. Once the US dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6th, the Soviets were compelled to declare war on Japan and to advance into Korea within the next 2 days. Attempting to stay ahead of the Soviets, the very next day, the US dropped its second bomb on Nagasaki, and President Truman threatened to rain down limitless more bombs should the Japanese not surrender. He was calling their bluff because at the moment that they dropped the second bomb, they only had those 2 bombs in hand, right? Knowing that they were needed to produce more, but that's what Truman had stated in his radio address. Overnight, the United States drafts a unilateral and hasty plan to divide the Korean peninsula along the 38th global latitudinal line. Bruce Cummings, a famous historian some of us may know, he finds that, quote, American officials consulted no Koreans on coming to this decision, nor did they ask the opinions of the British or the Chinese, both of whom were to take part in a planned trusteeship for Korea. There are 2 bigger reasons for this drastic move, in my opinion. Firstly, it was to demarcate a U.S. territory that would include Korea's capital city and everything south of it, and to create a limitation to Soviets that had already advanced to the southern part of the peninsula. So by the time these negotiations took place, communist troops had already entered into Busan. So the Joseph Stalin, was actually very ill-informed of the situation. Had he known, okay, this is a counterfactual question, but had he known where his troops were, he may never have agreed to the 38th parallel as a dividing line. But at any rate, this division began the U.S. imperial expansion into the Asian continent. A month after Japan's surrender, U.S. forces arrived in Korea and some 50,000 Japanese soldiers were discharged from Jeju Island. A few Japanese were reported to have abused some islanders upon their exit, but they did not resist American takeover, so they left fairly quietly. 60,000 Jeju Islanders repatriated back to the island from Japan, increasing the island's population to something like 280,000 people. A Jeju People's Committee was formed, led largely by the diasporic political activists, to work with the national government to represent the interests of the Jeju provincial majority. They seized the political and economic hegemony of Jeju right after the liberation. The U.S. pushed the UN to permit supervised elections only in the South, despite the fact that Canada, Australia, and 11 other members of the interim committee opposed the decision, and most other member countries abstained the move. Failure to hold free elections throughout the Korean Peninsula in 1948, you could imagine what kind of trauma this would have presented to the Korean people. They knew that this was going to deepen the division between North and South. That 38th parallel line was only ever supposed to be a temporary line. And that election then was going to cement that it was going to be a permanent division. So while most Koreans vehemently opposed the division of their country, Jeju Island protesters were among the most pronounced in this protest. For the United States, any resistance to their initiatives was seen as a potential communist insurgency. Although reunification negotiations continued in the months preceding the Korean War, tensions intensified. Cross-border skirmishes and raids around the 30th parallel persisted from the very beginning. In the spring of 1947, as tensions rose between the US and the Soviets, the US determined to create, quote unquote, situations of strength by introducing the Truman Doctrine in March. They then introduced the Marshall Plan in June, and then a communist containment mission in July. The Soviets responded by announcing a Zhdanov doctrine that divided the countries of the world into socialist and imperialist camps. The U.S. military covertly built and staffed up to 750 foreign military bases across half the countries around the world. The actual numbers of the bases that we have is actually impossible to determine. So, meanwhile, while this is happening, Korea became the only country in East Asia occupied by both the US and the USSR, the only place in the world where a rollback of communism was actually put into action. So, we're told that the Korean War began on June 25th of 1950. That day marks the moment where North Korean tanks and troops crossed the 38th latitudinal line, inciting the first hot war of the Cold War. But few outside of Korea are aware that immediately after World War II and up to 1950, there were these organized armed suppressions by Korean authorities and by US allied forces. Domestic and proxy forces bore more than 2 million dead in a military organized hunt that included an unprecedented ratio of dead civilians. For nearly 5 years before the official start of the Korean War, a bitter, intense civil conflict of cross-border attacks, violent political repression, peasant rebellion, and armed suppression ensued throughout Korea. The Jeju April 3rd incident is one of over 200 such cases of massive civilian purges found so far in Korea. The largest single massacre occurring in Nogunri in North Chuncheon province in central South Korea. The largest single massacre occurred there. But the earliest moment of anti-communist involvement may have been South Korea's autumn uprising. This is also known as the October 1st Daegu uprising of 1946. Workers on the mainland in the southern province of Daegu and Busan started a general strike in which civilians, government officers, and 156 businesses demonstrated against the chaotic direction their country was headed after the war. The U.S. military government, this is a new government, USAMGIK, in Korea deemed all labor strikes illegal, and they stamped out demonstrations with brutal force. So in that demonstration, 92 policemen, 163 civil workers, 116 civilians, and 240 rioters were killed. And then another 2,609 people were arrested. This was also the time when the National Police Agency began hinting that Jeju was an island of reds, quote, Red Island. Jeju's alienation from the mainland then was exacerbated due to their unique position with the kind of distance from the metropole during the colonial period. U.S. forces arrived on Jeju Island on September 28, 1945, to formally surrender the Japanese from the area, but they were slow to extend their control of the island, leaving many Koreans disgruntled by Japan's ongoing presence. On November of 1945, the U.S. military government disembarked at Jeju Island with Major Thurman Stout, commander of the 59th Military Government Company, who was appointed chief administrator of the island. Jeju Democratic People's Front was launched in February of 47 to gain local and national autonomy. Then during a March 1st anniversary march, so March 1st was a day that commemorated the independence movement from Japan. And so there was an anniversary march in which Jeju Islanders were participating in this march, commemorating that moment that against colonialism. So while they were marching, the police opened fire on residents. By mid-1947, then, U.S. military government in Korea dispatched an investigation team led by Colonel James Castile to Jeju. The military government focused its efforts on cracking down leftists rather than mollifying enraged public sentiment. The leadership of the police department concluded that Jeju was red, and 90%, this was a quote, they sent to DC, 90% of Jeju residents have a leftist hue to them, end quote. Although similar purges were happening on the mainland, what stands out to me about Jeju is that it has the characteristics of genocide, an orchestrated dual government operation that was intent on eradicating a distinctive population of people. The Bukcheon case, which follows this line of thinking, should help us illustrate that point. So here is a map of Jeju Island, a victim distribution map that has been is published through the Jeju 4-3 Council. Jeju Island, the largest island that sits 83 kilometers south of the Korean mainland. It also is positioned 374 kilometers northwest of Fukuoka, Japan. Although different moments have been identified as starting points for the 4-3 incident, the generally agreed upon catalyst is that it's tied to the events of the 3rd day of April, 1948. The Jeju Incident Investigation Report describes that moment as follows, quote, around 2 a.m. on April 3rd, 1948, the armed uprising led by the South Korea Labor Party in Jeju began with signal fires blazing at every odom on the mountainside of Mount Hala. At dawn that day, approximately 350 armed rebels simultaneously attacked 12 to 24 provincial police boxes. The police, Seobuk Young Men's Association's accommodation, and houses of key figures affiliated with right-wing organizations, including National Congress for Promoting Independence, were also targeted for attack. This action triggered the bloodshed, which lasted for 6 years and 6 months until Mount Hala standstill order was lifted on September 21st, 1954, end quote. Some scholars estimate that around 30,000 people were killed by various state agents that included the South Korean military, police, political organizations, and U.S. military government in Korea. The actual numbers, the exact numbers, are impossible to locate because so many bodies have gone missing and they are forever gone. But among the survivors, it's no exaggeration to say that every family member on Jeju Island was affected by this purge. So there was this indiscriminate killing of residents, including the eradication of children, women, and elderly. The Jeju 4-3 Peace Foundation finds that over a 2-year span, islanders regularly hunted down, and then the most intense killing happened between 1948 to early 1949. State directives stipulated that interior villages held the largest concentration of rebels. So that would be, this is Halasan, the Hala Mountain is in the center here. So the interior villages would be those that are closer to the peak. Um, but they also said that coastal communities should not be spared. Islanders were massacred in screening operations and house searches. They were bombed out of the Mount Hala lava tubes, while some 20,000 islanders managed to flee to Japan. Most islanders who used this escape route were shot to death at sea. And so that's another reason why the number of bodies surrounding the seafloor, it's impossible to estimate. Another thing to mention here, so we've got different gradations of red here that kind of show you when the kind of concentrated numbers of people were killed. And so um, you've got an area here, is a Nohyungni is the highest, and second to that is here. This is Bukcheon, the area that we'll be talking about. So to discuss this case, the case of Bukcheon Village, my screen is a little bit wonky. I'm not sure why. Anyway, I want to offer thanks to the people that helped me understand the Bukcheon Village case in 2016. So here on the left side, you see Dr. Sung-nae Kim, who hosted me as a visiting researcher at the Institute for the Study of Religions at Sogang University, and who introduced me to the PPNK organization, as I mentioned at the beginning. I consider Professor Kim a role model for what a scholar activist should be, and I'm so indebted to her in many ways. Unfortunately, we don't see the picture of the next people here, but they would have been. I think you might see a later slide of them. Mr. Woo Young Kim of Bukcheon Village. He's a village native who housed us and guided us through the village and many other key sites throughout Jeju. And then Mr. Seung Chan Lee, who was the director of Nobung Sungi Memorial. He walked us through the children's gravesite and also updated us on their ongoing installations. And then in July to August of 2016, a small group of us were on the tour of the monuments for 4-3. And so I'm grateful to them for this research. Oh, there he is. So that is this is Mr. Woo Young Kim. Can you guys see my cursor? I don't know. And this, okay, thank you. And this is the director, Seung Chan Lee. Oh, in the middle is Hyung Gi-young, very famous author that we'll talk about in a minute. All right. So, particularly harrowing to me was what happened on the east end of Jocheon district in a small village known as Bukcheon. On November 17, 1948, a newly elected South Korean president, Syngman Rhee, laid down the groundwork for a horrendous massacre to occur by declaring martial law on Jeju Island. What did martial law do? It basically meant that all people must be indoors in buildings by a certain hour, making it incredibly easy and effective for the police and the militia to round them up and kill them en masse. So that's the martial law order that you see here. Um, this looks a little different than, okay. So here is, this picture is of the Nobunsungi, the memorial hall and the ancestral tablets. On January 17th, 1949, after 2 soldiers were killed by armed guerrillas, the army massacred around 300 unarmed civilians in the fields and farms around Bukcheon Elementary School. So Mr. Kim emphasizes that how this village was purged to the extent that it was called a village of no men. That's literally the name they called it for many years. In this image, you see tombs delineated by volcanic stones. This is one of the areas in Bukcheon where the military ordered families to send their young children in a pretense to protect them during the military orders. They said that all like 1,000 villagers, I think there were around 1,000 villagers in Bukcheon, that they should gather at the elementary school because they were going to be given a speech about anti-communism. So they were all sent there and they're all gathered there. After separating relatives of military and police personnel, like kind of separating them aside, soldiers then took dozens of villagers at a time to nearby farms like this where they were shot to death. This is one of those farms where children were ordered to gather and then shot en masse. Others were forced to gather in the elementary school gymnasium, which then was burned down with people inside. The Nobunsungi Memorial Hall was erected next to this children's execution site. And there has been some slight modifications, as I've seen, made to the children's grave sites, this site, but those are fairly minor because they don't want to disturb the actual bodies, the corpses that have laid there. Um, of all the massacre sites, Bukchon suffered the highest concentration of civilian killings in the shortest span of time. After 5 years of mass killings by proxy, the U.S. initiated a United Nations-backed police action to fend off the North Koreans that had crossed the 38th parallel. The UN forces unleashed full military strikes on the Korean peninsula to give a sense of their determination to decimate the peninsula. In one single raid over the North Korean capital of Pyongyang, the UN military deployed a round of 1,403 sorties, 10,000 liters of napalm, 62,000 rounds of low-level strafing ammunition, and 697 tons of bombs. Americans were quote unquote frustrated by the Korea problem when they had just finished a war a few years earlier that wiped out a third of the world's population. A Times reporter had this to say about what he saw in Korea. Quote, much of this war is alien to American tradition and shocking to the American mind. For our men are waging this war as they are forced to wage it and as they will be forced to wage any war against communists anywhere in Asia. This means not the usual inevitable savagery of combat in the field, but savagery in detail, the blotting out of villages where the enemy may be hiding, the shooting and shelling of refugees who may include the enemy or who may be screening an enemy march upon their positions. And there is savagery by proxy, the savagery of our ally. They murder to save themselves the trouble of escorting prisoners to the rear. They murder civilians simply to get them out of the way or to avoid the trouble of searching and cross-examining them. And they extort information by means so brutal that they cannot be described. End quote. This same Time magazine reporter in Korea describes American soldiers exhibiting a new type of savagery in their killing fatigue. 3 months into the war, 97,000 tons of bombs, 7,800,000 gallons of napalm had been dropped, such that no targets remained. As a British military publication put it, quote, South Korea no longer exists as a country, end quote. The UN's Scorched Earth campaign was more brutal than his later involvement in Vietnam by far, with proportionally higher casualties. By February 1952, 1 out of every 9 men, women, and children in North Korea had been killed. By the time an armistice agreement was signed in July 1953, there were some 3 million casualties, over 10,000, mostly women and children displaced, and over 2 million permanently separated families. We may gain a better understanding of the difficulties in revealing such histories by looking at the kind of economic and political situation that Korea was left with after the war. So the Korean War made the United States the wealthiest country in the world. South Korea, at the same time, was made into the poorest country in the world. To give you a sense of this Korean War destruction ratio, 70% of textile industries, 70% of chemical industries, 40% of agricultural machinery industry, 10% of rubber industry were completely ruined. In terms of destroyed infrastructure, over 600,000 housing units, 47% of railroads, 1,656 roads of a total of 500 kilometers in length, 1,453 bridges, totaling 49 kilometers in length. They were all destroyed during the war. Rice crops they dropped by 65% of the annual product average, leading to incredible inflation. Due to the war, South Korea became, in fact, the third poorest country behind two other African countries in the world. In the, uh, the first year into the war, 44% of factory buildings and 42% of production factories lay in ruins. Among all the damages, the mining industry was the worst hit. About 51% of the mining industries were destroyed, um, estimating something like $549 million US dollars, accounting for 23% of all industrial damages. 80% of all power plants were destroyed. 2 months into the war, power production plummeted to 11,000 kilowatt an hour, a tenth of the power consumption level by the end of the Japanese colonialism era. Um, the total war damage was estimated as high as 41.23 billion won, which is the equivalent of something like 11.3 billion US dollars today. Um, so, I mean, not just that, South Korea was riddled with by US occupation, right? They were also riddled by political corruption domestically and the sluggish economic growth. Development was hindered by the division of the country, with most of the mineral and energy resources situated in the new northern enemy territory. Violent coup d'etat, military dictatorships, martial laws, these all kept South Korea suspended in a constant state of emergency. Even though Korea was utterly devastated, US Congress refused to approve their pledge of $162.5 million in relief when some congressmen actually claimed that Americans did their job to protect Koreans, let somebody else do the job of cleaning it up. By contrast, in the first 8 years after the conflict, North Korea carried out an impressive recovery under a highly organized, purposeful government, laying the foundations for a modern industrial society. So in the first at least decade and a half, they did proportionally much better than South Korea. Survivors of those massacred were coercively silenced under Syngman Rhee's First Republic. The new nation of South Korea put into place a National Security Act that ensured that any behavior or speech that criticized the government was a criminal offense. This meant that publicizing wrongful actions taken by the South Korean state or by the US would put those persons at risk of breaking the law and perhaps losing their lives. So survivors of these atrocities were silenced to maintain an American allegiance, while the South Koreans remained utterly destitute. After a botched election in the spring of 1960, massive protests erupted, causing Syngman Rhee to flee to the US. Due to escalating pressure from surviving families of those victims, a special investigation commission on the truth of innocent civilian massacre incidents was launched. A very long name. The commission released its finding of a mere 8,522 victims, which was ludicrous, right? Rather than millions of people. This barely scratched the surface of the numbers that were murdered, reinciting public uproar and sprouting informal memorials for the wrongfully killed. Then in the 1960s, Park Chung-hee, the presidential administration then bolstered a national defense and sent 312,852 troops to Vietnam. That made them the largest allied force to fight alongside the United States in the Vietnam War. That war shifted South Korea from working towards democracy and self-determination to being fully immersed in a US-led capitalist dictatorship that lasted all the way into the 1980s. So then how was this history recovered? It should be understood that throughout Korea, and what's especially acute in Jeju Island, is that perpetrators continue to live alongside their victim families. Local village people were selected to help police and military in their mission to kill people in the mountainous areas. In Jeju, people hid in mountainous caves while neighboring villages or young adults from the same village might have perpetrated the killing of their neighbors. This was those who assisted the police in these ways were later revenged. All Jeju hometowners share some connection to the massacre, but some of these villagers still cannot write their histories about how they helped perpetrators and their role in the conflict. So that story is yet to be clearly revealed. At this point, then, you might be wondering, how do we come to know these massacres if they were hushed for so many decades? At least in places like Bukcheon Village, much of that is owed to the survivors of the diaspora, Koreans living in Japan, known as Zainichi. Many Koreans moved to Japan under Japanese colonialism, as I had mentioned earlier. Then, under the Jeju conflict, they fled again to Japan. Today, there are some 600,000 Koreans continuing to live in Japan, and a disproportionately large part of that population is from Jeju Island. Many of these self-claimed refugees return regularly to Jeju to form villages of village restoration, to create neighborhood associations, to create business communities, to repair the island after the Korean War. These Ainichi have dedicated large amounts of private funds to develop massacre memorials and to commemorate the family members that they've lost in the island. So we return to the author, Hyun Gi-young, the author of Aunt Suni, Suni Samcheon, that I mentioned earlier. This man he deserves a mention here. He fled Jeju as a boy. He got his degree at Seoul National University, and then he began his writing career shortly thereafter. He began pushing against the fascistic national security policies in 1975 when he bravely serialized a novel called Father, and he prints that in serial form in East Asia Daily. The story included psychological trauma experienced by Jeju Islanders. Once that goes to print, he's emboldened by that, and 3 years later, he publishes another novel titled Suni Samcheon, or Aunt Suni, that's released in 1978. Where in this story, the protagonist, who closely resembles this author, he returns to Jeju Island after several years of living in Seoul to attend the funeral of his Aunt Suni. She was a massacre survivor who later took her own life. Shortly after the second novel was published, Hyun was arrested. He was tortured in prison for 3 days, and then he was released on the condition that he could never write about the massacre again in any genre on any platform ever again. So at risk of threats, torture, even death, Hyun actually continued to write on the massacre all the way into the 1990s. We owe so much to authors like and artists like Hyun Gi-young. In most parts of Jeju Island, mass burials were not revealed for over 60 years. For decades, the victims were not buried in properly identified official graves. Some 5,000 victims went missing because they were killed in secret places and buried together in mass pits in mysterious underground areas, leaving no trace and then concealing those violent acts. Even worse, those sites of massacres and secret burials were covered with heavy rocks and very thick soil so that they would never be tampered with. The survivors who knew about them left those in place for at least 7 years before they would start to commemorate them. And the point was they needed to be able to give them proper funeral rites and reburials outside of the watchful eye of the government administration. When survivors didn't have vocabulary for what had happened, right? Because it's not in the public eye. They could not reconcile their sufferings with state narratives. These were liminal subjects, vulnerable to political persecution and social ostracization. Their stories percolated then through local rituals for the dead. In the clandestine rebuilding stage, local politicians like petty politicians, massacre perpetrators, victims, families, um, they all came together to dangerously commemorate and honor the dead. It was not uncommon for former para-police officers, Korean War veterans, victim descendants to all congregate in the same memorial space to commune with the spirits of the mass murdered. Village and hometown identities superseded more recent identities like patriots and heroes or veterans, communists, insurgents, etc. During these commemorations, during these ceremonies, people engaged in very grueling and emotionally charged conversations. In the words of Professor Sung-nae Kim, quote, In the shamanic rituals of Jeju Island, the phenomenon of spirit possession is an opportunity for the spirit of the dead to borrow the body of the shaman to begin speaking spontaneously. End quote. Aggrieved ancestors reunite with and talk to their survivors via these shamanic rituals, helping to remind their survivors of their shared history and to attend to unfinished business. Ghostly narratives, Yeonge Ullim, which Professor Kim translates as lamentations of the dead, that are conveyed while the shaman is possessed by a ghost, acts in concert with survivor testimonies to create this rich, detailed shared history. Ancestral ghosts, their survivors, and ritual specialists work to collaborate and corroborate those stories, making those histories real. In Jeju, these are recorded as shiketchip, memorial ceremony transcripts, that then become testimony, transforming the ephemeral spiritual interaction into public documentation. So we see some of those early rituals that then become later highly publicized. So on the left side, we see Jeju Shimbang, who was conducting a trance dance where she falls as a victim in their moment before death. On the right side, the photo is of Jeonggongcheol Shimbang, who calls the souls of the many people who were killed in Bukcheon crop fields. The period from the 1980s through the early 2000s was an era of forensic truth, where national governments began exhuming mass burial sites around the world with the aim to present historical truths with particular evidentiary framing. So we've got this international community that's being formed around with United Nations support. In 1987, South Korea celebrated its first direct presidential elections and a restoration of civil rights. That year, Kim Dae-jung, who would later go on to become South Korea's president and win the Nobel Peace Prize, made his first public pledge to investigate the truth and to restore the honor of the victims of 4/3, becoming the only major political figure to consistently promise truth and justice reparations for Jeju victims. The democratization zeal of Korean society encouraged 4/3 survivors to use pseudonyms to publish their first collective testimonies in 1989. Then a joint April 3rd ritual committee was formed and hosted the 42nd anniversary memorial in 1990. 10 civilian organizations participated in the joint committee, sharing a common purpose to orchestrate their first commemoration. In this way, bereaved families and civilian victims who had endured enforced silence participated in their first public commemoration. It was performed in the form of shamanic ritual, calling for all souls of the dead victims to gather regardless of their ideological positions. The new democratic era of the 1980s opened possibilities to explore nationhood, subalternity, and civil disobedience. A new civic custom of ritualized protest helped to collectively express political resistance against oppressive state initiatives, with a particular focus on anti-Americanism. Labor and student activists using shamanic symbols invoked subaltern grassroots communities to organize around every major political center and university campus around the country. A rise in people's theater, Madangguk, incorporated elements of folk theater and shamanic ritual as a way of invoking people's shared history and social memory. That people's theater became then a method of performing a narrative of marginalized people to voice their collective concern, which helped establish shamanism as a pinnacle characteristic of a new democracy. In Jeju at this time, Jeju University students, emboldened by South Korea's first democratic elections, brought the 4/3 commemoration ceremony to the public. They launched a protest arguing that 7,000 deaths remained unaccounted for. The family associations of the bereaved student protesters, leftist activists, were all heavily surveilled, pressured by the police, and then otherwise pushed to stop tokenized public commemorations. Ironically, in the late 80s onward, political resistors and the South Korean state both found use for the shamanism quite useful. The very cultural motifs created by, for, or against the state were then appropriated in assertions of indigenous national folk identity. The inclusive commemorations of 4/3 soon sparked disagreements between the anti-communist bereaved families of the victims, the the ritual committee, leading them to hold separate commemorations at different locations. Up to that point, public commemorations were only permissible for bereaved families of the fallen military and police, and those people designated with national merit or honorable spirits. Families of civilian dead could only remember their dishonorable fallen victims in the privacy of their own homes. They had to keep that secret from even sometimes their neighbors or their extended kin. The 1990 Democratic Public Commemoration that was meant to include all 4-3 victims, including dead leftists and mountain armed guerrillas, put politically opposed groups of bereaved families from both the right and the left end of the political binary into this very difficult path to reconciliation. So some people call this the Jeju model, but I wouldn't say it's that smooth going. This 1990 Democratic Public Commemoration, um, uh, mere definitions at these commemorations sparked arguments over whether 4-3 was a communist riot or a people's uprising. Then in 1994, when a newly established provincial parliament intervened as a peacemaker by suggesting a joint commemoration, it began to pivot those opposing groups towards expressing some kind of determination to establish a common goal. But they've really kind of gone back and forth on that. And so the strife comes and goes. Um, in January 2000, the Jeju 4-3 special law was promulgated, officially recognizing the massacre and placing full responsibility for affairs related to the massacre on the hands of the South Korean state. So here on the left side, you see a forensics team unearthing a mass grave trench at a military airfield. They found two long trenches along this airfield where mass bodies were thrown in. And the few people that survived that said that they were the ones that had to dig out this trench and then throw themselves into it um, to be killed. So those exhumed bones are sites of border crossing flows between that living and dead, and vehicles of transforming ghosts into ancestral spirits. So you see the shaman on the right side doing that, repeating that unearthing of those bones. So that transformation from ghost to ancestral spirit then liberates the relationship with the unsettled dead. In these politics of post-memory, traumatic victims become culturally and politically respectable, and then trauma itself becomes an unassailable moral category for the sake of family and community repair. So I just have at the end here, and this will be the final uh, last two slides. So why then, with all of these things, with a special law put into place, is this history still hidden from us, especially those of us outside of Korea? Um, I think there are at least three reasons for this. The first one is that the Korean War never ended. This being the US's first non-victory, the US also quickly forgot about this war. So a lot of veterans argue that this was a forgotten war. While the Soviets lost only, I should say not only, mere 282 soldiers, China lost nearly 1 million soldiers to this war. Mao Zedong even lost his first son to this war. So historically, China stands very strong historically next to North Korea on this history. South Korea had the largest number of foreign troops, again, to fight alongside the US in Vietnam, as I said. So South Korea continues to be in a state of war with North Korea, and North Korea declares that South Korea must be freed from its US empire. Conservative presidents like the current Yoon administration believe that redress movements like the Jeju 4-3 incident weaken the South Korean state and compromise their national security. Their defense minister even said recently, quote, absolutely no massacres were ever committed by our troops, end quote. Meanwhile, the DMZ remains one of the most heavily fortified Cold War boundaries in the world. The threat from both sides continue. Jeju, which has been designated an island of peace, has now in recent years been remilitarized in preparation for a new Asia-Pacific war. There's also then the dysfunction of the United Nations. There's this kind of problem of large nation immunity and small nation dependency. On December 9th, 1948, the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crime of Genocide was established when it was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly. This significant human rights treaty solidified the international community's commitment to preventing and punishing genocide following the atrocities of the Second World War, right? That's something that US was very well aware of. As Justice Rabindranath Pal, Indian justice who sat on the Tokyo war crimes jury, pointed out, the US should have been held responsible for said violations in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In 2003, South Korea's National Committee for the Investigation of the Truth concluded that the U.S., quote, the U.S. Army military government and the Korean military shared responsibility for the incident, end quote. But this argument has had no traction. This leads me to share the argument made by Hannibal Travis that, quote, the largest nations, notably Algeria, China, India, Mexico, Nigeria, Pakistan, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, and the United States, remain within the Cold War rubric of impunity for mass violence and diplomatic support for its perpetrators. The U.S. continued to not be held responsible for the violations they committed in Korea, in Vietnam, or anywhere else. Meanwhile, Rwanda, Serbia, Iraq, and Cambodia saw the convocation of UN-backed war crimes trials. In other words, the power imbalance between nations in international tribunals tilt in favor of large nations like the USA, demonstrating the dysfunction of the United Nations and such international tribunals. Finally, there's the problem of the ultra right. Due to the hard work of many local and international activists, Jeju Island has been recognized as a political neutral territory. On July 27, 2005, the South Korean government designated as the Island of World Peace after it was used to host a series of unprecedented high-level summits with former Soviet Union and People's Republic of China. In turn, Seoul declared that they would work towards recognizing islander demands for reconciliation and human rights violations stemming from the 4-3 incident. Then, in 2007, under Barack Obama's administration, the U.S. initiated an Asia pivot strategy by asking South Korea to allow them to build a joint civilian military complex port in order for the United States to contain China's activity in the region. International peace activists flooded to this area, and they were protesting remilitarization of the island ever since. Although the U.S. claimed that civilian cruise ships could also dock in this area, its primary function was to house a THAAD missile defense system, up to 20 nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, destroyers, and submarines, making this the U.S.'s largest, most expensive base in the Pacific, with 1.4 billion US dollars. That was the number that we had in 2016. They've greatly expanded it since then. South Korean government ignored the overwhelming local opposition and agreed to America's proposal, essentially overturning the island's peace designation. In June 2011, protesters from around the world gathered at Jeju, the proposed construction site, delaying construction for several months. The following year, the South Korean Supreme Court upheld the base's construction. Activists remained on the street, pleading the international community to continue helping them prevent another massacre from happening. Meanwhile, Samsung and Daelim corporations ignored international environmental pleas, destroying coral, sea life, and local fishing industries on the southern tip of the island to make way for almost 500,000 square meters of land needed for the base construction. In 2016, when I visited, they had a youth peace center, library, cafe, artist center in Gangjeong, in support of the community that was protesting this naval development. When I went back earlier this year, they all ceased to exist. But in online news feeds like Save Jeju Now, they continue to monitor and keep the international community abreast of developments in the area. They continue to work with the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Amnesty International. So let me just move forward to some recommendations since we're running out of time. What can we do? Well, organizations like this Protestant Peace Network of Korea is a very important organization that must continue to help us identify these human and ecological injustices that stem from armed conflict and weapons of mass destruction. We need to continue to support Indigenous people to be at the center of peacemaking conversations. Rivera argues that power, wellness, and liberation are never political or psychological. They are always both. Armed with this power, traumatized communities may be able to establish public forms of reconciliation like formal reburials, memorials, museums, education campaigns. In order to secure harm reduction, we need better networks to build resilience and to elevate our coexistence. We need to allow North Korea and other states that we consider enemy states to uphold their legitimacy as sovereign
맞아.
states and to continue working at peace building dialogue. We should negotiate peace treaties between the Koreas to formally end the Korean War and to break the polarizing binds of the Cold War. We also need to hold the US and the United Nations accountable for their shortcomings and work towards a more inclusive alternative global regulatory body led by non-aligned nations. Rather than transitional justice or restorative justice, consider transformative justice models that deliberately work outside of existing local global judicial carceral systems. These question traditional public education systems. They counter monuments and memorial movements and the like. We need to advance acknowledgement of sexual violence during micro conflicts as crimes against humanity, something that I didn't have time to discuss today, and increase the collaboration between female and children victim communities of armed conflict between nations from both sides of the Cold War binary. Lastly, I want to thank my students from Hiram College for going on this venture with me a few months ago, and I wish all of you at PPNK a wonderful trip in October.